Welcome to the Right News Network.
Hello and welcome. I'm Emma with the headlines that matter most right now. Budget airline Spirit Airlines has shut down after 34 years of operation, leaving thousands of workers without jobs and stranding passengers nationwide. The carrier collapsed after failing to secure a $500 million government bailout from the Trump administration. Our Washington correspondent Marcus Webb has this. Marcus?
Well, Emma, Spirit announced this morning it's starting an orderly wind-down effective immediately. The airline had been in talks with the Trump administration about that $500 million rescue package, but negotiations stalled when bondholders balked at the terms. So by Friday, when the White House made what they called their final proposal, Spirit's leadership determined they couldn't make a deal work.
What pushed the airline to this point in the first place?
Look, jet fuel prices have basically doubled, and Spirit, being a budget carrier operating on razor-thin margins, just couldn't absorb those costs. I mean, they were hemorrhaging money. Even with government money on the table, the structure of any potential bailout wasn't going to work for the bondholders who had claims on the company. It's a perfect storm of bad timing and bad math.
Marcus, appreciate it? Continuing on world affairs, the standoff between Washington and Tehran is hitting American wallets at the pump. President Trump rejected Iran's latest peace proposal Friday, the same day a war powers deadline expired, saying he won't accept Tehran's terms. Gas prices surged to $4.39 a gallon in the biggest jump since the ceasefire was announced in April. Also on the world front, the U.S. is pulling 5,000 troops out of Germany in what amounts to the Trump administration following through on a threat made during an increasingly bitter feud with the German chancellor. Our Middle East correspondent Layla Nazari has more on what triggered this decision. Layla?
Well, Emma, what set this off was really a comment that German Chancellor Friedrich Merz made about Iran. He said Iran was humiliating the United States, and that clearly struck a nerve with President Trump. The White House saw it as criticism of American military strategy in the Middle East, so Trump fired back. And now we've got the Pentagon announcing that roughly 5,000 troops, that's about 14% of the U.S. force in Germany, will be withdrawn over the next year.
So how much of this is actually about Iran policy versus just Trump being upset personally?
I mean, look, it's both. Trump is absolutely irritated by what he sees as allied nations second-guessing his Iran strategy. But there's also a larger pattern here about defense spending and who's carrying the load in NATO. Germany's been pushing back on increased military budgets while offering what Trump considers weak diplomatic messaging about the Middle East. So the troop withdrawal is leverage. A way of saying, if you're not going to back U.S. policy, why should we keep that many troops there? The thing is, this kind of public dispute doesn't help anyone right now.
Layla Nazari, thanks for that context. Continuing on world affairs, a major fertilizer shortage tied to the Iran conflict could leave billions without enough food to eat. And still with us, Layla Nazari, what are we hearing from industry leaders on this crisis?
Well, Emma, the head of Yara International, the world's biggest fertilizer company, is sounding the alarm here. He's saying that if this Iran situation doesn't get resolved quickly, we're looking at a real problem with fertilizer supply chains. And here's the thing. It's not just about crops failing. It's about the poorest countries in Africa and elsewhere literally being priced out of the market. They won't be able to afford what little fertilizer is available.
So which regions are most vulnerable right now?
Look, Africa's really at the center of this concern. These are countries that already struggle with food security, and they rely heavily on imported fertilizer. If prices spike the way experts think they will, they simply don't have the budget to compete with wealthier nations. It's going to create what's being called a global auction, and the poorest bidders lose.
Layla, thank you for breaking that down for us. Still on world affairs, the ability of Western forces to defend their bases in Iraq is now being tested at unprecedented scale. Coalition troops successfully intercepted more than 100 Iranian-linked drones and missiles targeting their position, with around 28 strikes arriving daily at the height of the campaign. Expect continued military posturing and potential diplomatic efforts as both sides assess next moves in the escalating regional conflict. Also on the world front, the Iran war is triggering a dual crisis: mass executions at home and economic shock abroad. Iran executed 21-year-old karate champion Sasan Azadvar this week as the UN warns of a death penalty surge, while the conflict is simultaneously draining global military stockpiles and sending oil prices soaring. The US is now warning European allies they'll face delays in arms shipments, including systems critical to Ukraine's defense against Russia. Still on world affairs, the Iran conflict is driving oil prices higher while simultaneously strangling the supply lines that deliver humanitarian aid to refugees worldwide. The UN's refugee agency has been forced to reroute shipments away from the Red Sea through more expensive land corridors across the Arabian Peninsula and Turkey. Watch for oil prices to remain volatile as markets assess whether the full scope of regional risks has been priced in. A federal appeals court has just blocked the mailing of one of the most widely used abortion medications across the entire country. This affects millions of Americans seeking medication abortion. Our technology correspondent Alex Park has the details. Alex?
Well, Emma, what's happening here is pretty significant. A federal appeals court issued a nationwide order that bars telehealth providers from dispensing mifepristone and stops the mail distribution of this drug entirely. It's the medication used in roughly half of all US abortions. So we're talking about a major restriction on how people can access this procedure.
How does this actually change what's available to patients right now?
Look, the reality is, patients now have to physically go to a clinic to get this medication, rather than having it mailed to them. In states where clinics are sparse or far away, and there are plenty of those, this creates real barriers. It's going to disproportionately affect people in rural areas and those without the means to travel for medical care.
Thank you, Alex. On the energy front, Ukraine's escalating campaign against Russian oil infrastructure is threatening Moscow's ability to fund its war machine at a moment when global crude prices are climbing. And Marcus is back with us. Marcus, what's the latest on these drone strikes?
Well, Emma, we're talking about 4 attacks on the Russian Black Sea port of Tuapse in just 1 week. The most recent hit came early Friday morning. But what's really significant here is that Ukraine's not just hitting ports anymore. They've also struck a major refinery deep inside Russia and a pumping station nearby. So they're targeting the entire supply chain: export, processing, distribution.
Why is Russia suddenly so vulnerable right now?
Look, here's the thing. Oil prices have jumped because of Middle East tensions, which normally helps Russia's bottom line. They've got India buying their crude again, thanks to US waivers. So Ukraine sees this window where Russia's actually making money off oil and decides, no, we're going to shut that down. It's brilliant economic warfare, honestly. Russia can't defend everywhere at once.
Marcus, appreciate it. Turning to a critical global choke point, the Strait of Hormuz remains closed in a standoff with enormous consequences for world energy markets and shipping. China's UN ambassador says reopening that vital waterway is now an urgent priority that will shape high-level talks with President Trump. Watch for whether Tehran's latest proposal gains any traction or whether the blockade continues to tighten.
Time to go deeper. Beyond the headlines, our full analysis of the story shaping the world right now.
Spirit Airlines, one of America's most recognizable budget carriers, has officially ceased operations immediately after 34 years in business and a failed $500 million bailout attempt that collapsed when bondholders refused the Trump administration's final terms. Thousands of workers are now out of jobs. Hundreds of thousands of passengers are stranded or scrambling for refunds, and the question of whether the government was right to walk away is already becoming one of the most heated economic debates of the week. Joining me now are Marcus Webb, our defense and security analyst, and Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor. Marcus, let me start with you. Is this a story about a free market working as it should, or did the Trump administration just abandon thousands of American workers for the sake of a philosophical talking point?
Thanks, Emma. And look, I want to push back on the framing of that question immediately, because I think it's exactly the framing the left wants us to use. The Trump administration didn't abandon anyone. Spirit Airlines abandoned Spirit Airlines. This is a company that built a business model so fragile that a fuel price spike, a predictable fuel price spike, could bring the entire thing down. The Trump administration put a proposal on the table, a final proposal. The bondholders said no. That's not government failure. That's a market adjudicating on a bad bet. Ben Shapiro has made this argument so many times, it should be tattooed on the wall of every congressional office. When you remove consequences from bad decisions, you guarantee more bad decisions. And I'd go further. If the Trump administration had written that $500 million check under those conditions, every struggling airline with bad management and worse balance sheets would be lining up at the Treasury door within 12 months. The precedent matters enormously here.
But Marcus, here's what I'd push back on. We bailed out the banks in 2008. We bailed out the auto industry. We bailed out airlines after COVID. Isn't the Trump administration applying a principle inconsistently here? And Sophia, what's your take on this?
Well, look, Marcus isn't wrong about the free market principle, but here's what I think he's missing in the political context. The inconsistency Emma just identified is real, and it matters. The 2008 bank bailouts, the auto bailouts, the post-COVID airline support, all of that was justified, rightly or wrongly, on systemic risk grounds. The argument was that these entities were too interconnected to fail without catastrophic downstream effects. Spirit Airlines does not meet that threshold. Spirit carried somewhere between 2 and 3% of total U.S. air passenger volume. The capacity it provided can be absorbed by Frontier, Allegiant, and the legacy carriers on most of its routes. So the actual systemic risk argument for this bailout was always paper thin, and the Trump administration was right to test it against hard numbers. Where I part ways with Marcus slightly is on the bondholder dynamics. The real story here is that the people with the most leverage in these negotiations, the bondholders, made a calculated bet that the government would blink first. They were wrong. And that's actually a healthy signal to send.
I hear what Sophia is saying, but, and I say this with respect, she's being too generous to the institutional players here. The bondholders didn't just make a miscalculation. They ran a strategy of brinksmanship with taxpayer money as the potential prize. And this is what should make every conservative's blood boil. These are sophisticated financial actors who bought distressed Spirit debt at a discount, specifically hoping for a government rescue that would pay them out at par or better. That's not capitalism. That's corporate welfare by another name. It's the same game played in slow motion. When Tucker Carlson talks about the corrupt alliance between big finance and big government, this is exactly what he means. You don't solve that problem by handing them the $500 million. You solve it by making absolutely clear that the Treasury is not a backstop for bad private bets.
Here's what I want to know, because this is the question that matters for the next 6 months. If Spirit's capacity disappears from leisure routes and secondary markets, fares go up, working Americans get squeezed, and Democrats use that as ammunition for more regulation. Sophia, where do you see this going?
The way I see this playing out, the short-term pain on specific routes is real, but temporary. History is actually quite clear on this. When a budget carrier exits a market, fares spike, but competition follows the margin. Frontier and Allegiant have been expanding aggressively. The real risk over 6 months isn't that cheap travel disappears. It's the political narrative that gets constructed around the price spikes when they happen. If Democrats can point to a 40% fare increase on the Dallas to Orlando route and say, this is what happens when Trump lets airlines die, that's a powerful political weapon, regardless of whether it's economically accurate. The Trump administration needs to get ahead of that story now, not reactively.
Here's what concerns me most, and this is the scenario nobody's really talking about yet. If this becomes a template and Congress starts pushing for mandatory route protections, pricing regulations, or enhanced government oversight of airline financial structures as a response to the Spirit collapse, we're looking at a regulatory overreach that will make the aviation market significantly less competitive over the long term. History tells us that crises, real or manufactured, are almost always the mechanism through which government expands. The Spirit collapse is small. The regulatory response to the Spirit collapse could be anything but.
Sobering analysis from both of you. Marcus Webb, Sophia Reeves. Thank you. One thing is absolutely certain tonight. Somewhere in the Spirit Airlines boardroom, there's a very expensive lesson being learned about the difference between a safety net and a blank check. And the Trump administration just made sure everyone knows which one they're offering. The Pentagon has confirmed it. 5,000 American troops are leaving Germany within the next 6 to 12 months, roughly 14% of the total U.S. military presence there, in what is being described as the direct consequence of a bitter public falling out between President Trump and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz over the U.S.-Israeli campaign against Iran. Germany says the decision was anticipated. NATO says it's working to understand the details. And the rest of the world is watching what may be the most significant rupture in transatlantic relations since the Iraq War. Joining me now are Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor, and James Chen, our geopolitical analyst. Sophia, let me start with you. Is Trump right to do this? And is this the beginning of the end for NATO as we've known it?
Thanks, Emma. Look, let me be direct. Trump is not only right to do this, he's arguably 20 years too late. Germany has a GDP of $4 trillion. It spent years contributing around 1.2% of GDP to defense, well below the 2% NATO target it voluntarily committed to. Meanwhile, American taxpayers are shelling out 3.5% of their own GDP to maintain an alliance that benefits Germany's security and Germany's wallet simultaneously. Friedrich Merz then has the audacity to publicly describe Iran as humiliating America, while German troops sit under an American security umbrella that Berlin has chronically refused to fund. Tucker Carlson has been pilloried for asking the obvious question, why should American workers pay for the defense of wealthy European nations that won't pay for themselves? And every time the foreign policy establishment sneers, events prove him more right. This withdrawal is leverage. It's consequence. And frankly, it's the only language that gets through to governments addicted to free security. My concern is not that Trump is doing this. My concern is that European leaders are still not taking it seriously enough to change their behavior.
But Sophia, isn't there a legitimate argument that pulling troops mid-conflict, when Iran is destabilizing the Middle East and Russia is still a threat on Europe's eastern flank, is dangerously reckless timing regardless of who's right on the underlying principle? And James, what's your take on this?
Well, look, I agree with Sophia on the underlying structural problem completely. But here's what I think she's missing on the execution. The timing of this withdrawal is tied directly to a personal spat over a single set of comments from Merz about Iran. And when you start making strategic military deployments contingent on whether a foreign leader's press conference annoyed the president, you introduce a level of transactional unpredictability that actually weakens American deterrence rather than strengthening it. Adversaries aren't watching Germany here. They're watching Washington. Russia is watching. China is watching. And what they're seeing is that America's security commitments can be revised based on a news cycle. The data point that concerns me is Ramstein Air Base. It's one of the most critical U.S. logistics hubs on the planet, serving operations across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Any political signal that American presence there is negotiable has consequences that go far beyond Germany's defense spending.
I hear what James is saying, but with respect, that misses the point entirely. Every administration since Clinton has tried the polite, predictable, institutionally managed approach to getting Europe to fund its own defense. Every single one. And it has failed. Every time. You know what changes behavior? Consequences. Real ones. Not strongly worded letters from the State Department. Trump pulled troops once before, and Germany started moving on its spending targets. The problem is the moment pressure eases, European governments revert to type because their domestic political incentives, spend on welfare, not weapons, never change. Unpredictability is not a bug here. It's a feature. Sometimes you need to rattle the cage so hard the occupants actually wake up. And quite frankly, if Merz thought publicly undercutting American foreign policy on Iran would come without cost, he needed to learn otherwise. Fast.
Here's what I want to know, and I want both of you on this. Where does this actually go? Because we're not just talking about 5,000 soldiers, we're potentially talking about the long-term architecture of Western security. James, where do you see this playing out over the next 6 months?
The way I see this playing out, there are really two plausible paths. The first is that this functions as genuine shock therapy. Germany and its European partners finally build real defense capacity, NATO restructures into a more balanced burden-sharing arrangement, and the alliance actually emerges stronger in the medium term, even if the short term is turbulent. That's the optimistic read. The trajectory I'm more concerned about is that European political leadership, and let's be honest, looking at Brussels right now, looking at the institutional machinery there, simply isn't capable of moving fast enough to fill the gap. And if that's the case, the risk is a window of genuine strategic vulnerability that Russia in particular may be tempted to probe. History tells us that power vacuums don't stay empty for long.
Here's what concerns me most, and this keeps me up at night more than the troop numbers themselves. It's the Iran dimension. The U.S.-Israeli campaign against Tehran has already created a global oil price crisis. European energy markets are exposed. Germany, post-Nord Stream, is already in a structurally vulnerable energy position. If Merz continues playing to his domestic audience by publicly distancing Germany from American Iran policy, and if Trump responds with further withdrawals or starts hinting at reduced Ramstein access, you are looking at a scenario where the transatlantic alliance fractures, not gradually, but suddenly. And once that trust is broken at the political level, once the signal goes out that America's commitments are genuinely negotiable, the consequences don't stay contained to Germany. They reverberate through every security arrangement Washington maintains, globally.
Sophia Reeves, James Chen, a debate that could honestly run all night, and probably should. One thing's certain, Chancellor Merz is learning the hard way that when you freeload for 80 years and then criticize the person picking up the bill eventually lands on your desk.
That wraps up today's top stories. I'm Emma. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.